Good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today in our Unfolding the Word studies. We're in the midst of a study of Daniel, and we're looking at Daniel chapter 7, an incredible dream that God had sent to Daniel in the very first year of Belshazzar's reign, the final king of Babylon, 10 years before the chapter 5 events in which Babylon falls to the Medo-Persians. This dream parallels the dream in chapter 2 that was given to Nebuchadnezzar. The difference is that we learn a lot more detail in the chapter 7 dream as it's given to Daniel. I want to read today Daniel chapter 7, verses 7 and 19. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, and it devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. Verse 19 tells us, Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. We've been talking about in this dream that the turbulent seas out of which these beasts emerge represents the flow of time and history. The beasts are various nations, empires that God has permitted to emerge over time, empires particularly that are influencing the Israelite people, the Jewish people. God, who is the Lord of history, can give such a prophetic dream because he's in charge of how it all unfolds. The first of the scenes, and there were 7 different distinctive scenes within the dream. The first of these was the kingdom of the flying lion, which that beast represented Babylon, the current empire at the time of the dream. Scene number 2, the kingdom of the bear beast, represented the Medo-Persian Empire, which in 10 short years would be coming on the scene, finally defeating Babylon and taking over as the empire of the day. Scene 3, which we looked at yesterday, was the kingdom of the leopard, the flying leopard, the 4 wings, the 4 heads. And that particular kingdom references the coming Greek empire under Alexander the Great, and upon his death, broken into 4 pieces, headed up by generals that had worked under Alexander. Now today, scene number 4 introduces us to the kingdom of the terrifying beast. A kingdom, in both of the verses that I read to you, that is described as different from all of those that came before. Well, this 4th kingdom, this terrifying kingdom, the kingdom of iron teeth, is clearly a reference to the empire of Rome, which, by the way, parallels the legs of iron in the chapter 2 dream given to Nebuchadnezzar. Rome was different from everyone who came before it. Oh, it was still an empire, but different in some very significant ways. Rome, as it began to grow in power, gradually took over those areas that had been under the Greek control, those 4 different regions. It began by taking over Macedonia and Greece, which was one of those regions. They did that in 146 BC. Then gradually, decade by decade, they began to expand out into the other areas, the Asia Minor, the Seleucid, the Ptolemaic areas, until finally in 30 BC, they defeated ultimately the Ptolemaic Empire controlling Egypt, the final leader of which was Cleopatra. At any rate, eventually they took over, and therefore they were the ones influencing the Holy Land and influencing the Jewish people. This Roman Empire was described in this dream as a terrifying, dreadful, and exceedingly strong empire, a power reflected in teeth of iron. The fact of the matter is, historians looking at the Roman Empire are essentially united in the conclusion that Rome, in a very real sense, was more crushing and exploitative and repressive than all of the other empires that came before it. It was, in fact, different. as this passage tells us. It was different from all the beasts that came before. It was a kingdom different in significant ways. Number one, it was a kingdom that God said would be different in its size. Rome spread to include an area bigger than any of the previous empires. It spread into Western Europe and Central Europe. It spread all the way over to essentially the ends of the Medo-Persian Empire and the Alexandrian Empire heading toward India. It spread into North Africa. It spread and expanded in much of that region of Europe, Asia Minor, North Africa. Different in size. All the others, however big they were, sort of paled in scope to the Roman Empire. It was also very different as an empire, the previous ones, different in its organizational structure. Rome was very centralized in its control. All decisions eventually emerged from Rome itself. Their structure was such that while the empire was broken into some smaller regions, ruled over by, quote, kings, puppet rulers who had been put in place by Rome, Rome was still the master controller. And all of these other sort of kings served a subservient process and purpose in the Roman mentality. By the way, King Herod, king at the time of the birth of the Lord Jesus, was one of these puppet kings under the Roman control, the Roman thumb. Another of the differences in Rome that set it apart, and God was telling us through Daniel this was going to happen, was different in its cultural dominance. They tried to transplant Roman culture everywhere. So whether it was up in what is now modern-day England, or whether it was all the way in modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, or whether it was in North Africa or in the Holy Land, they did what they could do to create a Roman culture there. And they were pretty successful because the Roman cultures have continued to influence many of these regions even to the current day. So they were massive in trampling everything else out of the way and replacing it with the Roman culture. It was also different from other countries that came before it, other nations, in its duration. It lasted longer than the other beasts did. Chapter 2 dream tells us that it branched into two legs, and the west leg, the Western Empire, headquartered in Rome, actually lasted until around 450 AD. The eastern leg, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered at Constantinople, lasted until about 1500 AD. When you think about the length of the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, they all pale in comparison to the stranglehold, in a way, that Rome held for so many years. But the biggest difference, and this is the one I want to end with today, the biggest difference with the coming Roman Empire that God was telling Daniel about, and us as a result, is that it was an empire that never really stopped. Oh, it went through rises and falls. It went through periods where it seemingly disappeared for a while in terms of its political controls. But unlike the other beasts, it never died. Babylon died. Medo-Persian Empire died. The Greek Empire and all of its subsequent divisions died. The Roman Empire never completely died. In fact, even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the other countries in what's now modern Europe continued to try to be seen as the inheritors of the Roman Empire. And therefore, through much of the Middle Ages, we had the Holy Roman Empire existing. The point of it all is that it continued to influence even after its political domination was gone. And more importantly for our purposes, these passages in this dream told us that Rome would eventually re-emerge. Rome would come on the scene once again, a revitalized empire. It would re-emerge in a different form. It would reemerge as a conglomeration, a confederation of 10 nations. We'll look more about that tomorrow as we examine the kingdom of the 10-horned beast. Join me then, won't you? God bless.